Okay, time now to move on to a chapter called Night in the Mountains. You'll remember T.M. Power's just come ashore from the river, and the sampan with its roof blown away has floated off down the river again. He climbed the cliff with glory to the Republic, glory of the Republic, but he couldn't carry the ducklings. So he set them adrift in their floating home, the dishpan, and saw them swirling round and floating away in the river. So that is goodbye for those ducklings. Let's hope they make it okay. So, Night in the Mountains. They were hills. They weren't mountains, but hills or mountains, all that mattered to T.M. Pow and the little pig that trudged beside him was that they were terribly hard to climb. The going down among the rocks and brush was almost as hard as the going up. The early dawn, when T.M. Pow had shoved the dishpan with the ducklings back into the river, seemed far away and long ago. The rain was falling steadily again, but though T.M. Pow had travelled long, his own village had not loomed up again out of the rain gloom. For that one thing, the exhausted T.M. Pow felt dumbly grateful. He hoped he had gone far around it. It must be afternoon. T.M. Pow still clutched the bowl of watery rice, but he did not dare stop to eat. He was hungry, he was exhausted, but he did not dare to stop to rest. There were paths in the little mountains, but T.M. Pow did not dare to use them. Coolies came down those paths, and farmers. Once from his height among the rocks, T.M. Pow had even seen a Japanese soldier hurrying down a distant path, and once he had seen a woman like his mother. Even her walk had been like his mother's walk, tall, straight, and willow slim. His heart pounding, T.M. Pow had watched her, and everything in him had wanted him to run down to her, to tell her what had happened to him, and to ask her what to do. But he'd kept his distance. He'd kept himself hidden while he watched her out of sight. He still did not trust himself to go among his own people. He did not know whether it would be safe in this country that the Japanese had taken over. Perhaps the Japanese soldier would have paid no more attention to him than he had to the other Chinese that he had passed on the path, but T.M. Pow didn't know. In the late afternoon, T.M. Pow suddenly could go no farther. He broke into a cold sweat. His legs trembled under him. He was nauseated with hunger. He had reached the top of a round grassy hill. There were a few sheltering bushes, and he crawled behind them. He had to eat, had to rest. He dug his hand into the rice bowl and gulped a choking big mouthful. Glory of the Republic began tearing at the grass. T.M. Pow dug his hand into the bowl again, stuffed his mouth full, and again his hand went to the bowl. He pulled it back. There was only a good handful of rice left in the bottom of the bowl. He mustn't touch it, mustn't eat it. He mustn't keep looking at it. It had to be saved for one more meal. He heard voices. He peered through the bushes. A group of boys and girls were coming up the hill with baskets on their backs and grass knives in their hands. They came slowly and weakly like old people. They even looked like old people. The skin was drawn like old paper over their cheekbones. The children stopped halfway up the hill, cut grass with their hooked knives. Those children put their baskets down and began sawing at the sparse grass. They stuffed whole handfuls into their mouths before they put as much as a blade of grass into their baskets. Then one little boy began to eat mud. T.M. Powell looked on, horrified. The mud-eating boy was the smallest of the lot. He kept away from the others as if he were ashamed. He dragged himself round behind his bloated, huge stomach. His sticks of legs looked silly under that big stomach. And now the little boy scooped up a handful of dirt again and brought it to his mouth. His sister saw it and scolded him in a tired old way. The other children looked up, but did not seem to care. The little fellow hung his head. He slowly opened his hand and let the mud dribble out of it. He looked at his empty, dirty hand and began to cry. T.M. Powell looked on, sickened. His glance went from the skeleton boy with the bloated stomach to the sturdy little pig beside him. Suddenly he was desperately afraid. Glory of the Republic was food. He was in danger from these starving people. If those children down the hill saw the little pig, they would fall upon him and tear him to pieces. They'd drink his warm blood. The little shamed boy who had eaten the dirt had thrown himself down and lay, face hidden. Face hidden in his arms, sobbing. The other children had gone out of sight, around the side of the hill. T.M. Powell could stand it no longer. He took Glory of the Republic by the rope and stole towards the crying boy. Without a sound, he set the rice bowl on the ground close to the little fellow's head. When he'd at last look up from his hungry, shamed crying, he'd see food. T.M. Powell started to steal away, but 10 paces beyond the little boy he broke into a hard run. He had to run even though these starved, weak children couldn't possibly catch him and glory of the Republic. He and the pig raced down the hill and up and over the next one. T.M. Powell wasn't weary anymore. He wasn't hungry. He wanted to rush on and on, over this rocky hill and the next, far from this country and the evil Japanese had brought to it. Glory of the Republic could not stand the pace, or he did not like it. He began dragging on the end of the rope, and he tried to grab handfuls of grass in passing. T.M. Powell would not let him. He did not dare stop for anything now, for now he remembered other things. All this rainy day he had not seen one little black goat. Always before the little black goats had capered in the mountains. He had not seen a single ox in a field, a pig in a yard, nor a water buffalo in a single rice paddy below the mountains. There hadn't even been one lean dog on any mountain path, or around the mud huts along the paddies. It could only mean that the Japanese had taken everything from the people, and the hungry people had eaten the dogs. But if the Japanese had taken everything, he wasn't safe in these hills with a pig. The thought stopped T.M. Powell in his tracks. He wasn't safe in daylight. He'd merely been lucky so far, this dark rainy day, but the Japanese had but to get one glimpse of him with a pig, and they'd know he wasn't from this wasted land. There were no pigs. T.M. Powell stared desperately around him from the tall rock on which he was standing. He did not know what to do. He wanted to rush away from this horrible country, but it would be dangerous to take another step in daylight. Sooner or later, he and his pig would be seen. Glory of the Republic rooted about while Tien Pao stood hesitating. The little pig snorted and dug. Leaves rustled at Tien Pao's feet. Pebbles rattled. He became so noisy it finally aroused Tien Pao's attention. He looked down. Right at his feet, Glory of the Republic had shoved himself under a rock ledge. He'd almost disappeared. Only his curly, excited tail still showed. Under the ledge was a little cave. The little pig had found a cave. Suddenly Tien Pao knew what to do. Hide in little caves by day and travel by night. He dropped to hands and knees beside the rooting pig, helped him dig out the collected leaves and debris until the cave was big enough. After a long look all round to see that no one had observed them, Tien Pao squirmed into the opening with Glory of the Republic. It was a narrow little hole, but Tien Pao reached out and scraped all the leaves back into the entrance. When the cave's opening was completely closed with leaves, Tien Pao and his pig stretched out behind them to wait for the coming of night. It was a horrible, tense feeling lying in a hole in a rock in the daytime, waiting and listening, but the little cave was high and far from any path. Gradually, as not a single sound penetrated the wall of leaves, Tien Pao began to feel safer. No one was near. No one had passed the mouth of the cave. Tien Pao eased his tense, rain-soaked body. Gradually, a little warm light began filtering through the leaves. The cave was becoming snug, warm almost. But warmth, light, that meant the sun. The sun must have come out. After all the days, the rain had at last had stopped. Outside, the sun was shining. The comfort of the sun warmth, the stillness, the waiting, brought a new sick gnawing. All in a moment, Tien Pao went sick with longing for his mother and his father and the baby sister. The desperation grew so strong, Tien Pao had to fight himself to keep from bursting through the leaves and start running home. Impossible as it was, the homesickness gnawed at his insides like a huge, relentless rat. He mustn't cry. Crying made noise. He mustn't. He wasn't a baby. Suddenly Tien Pao shoved his face hard against the little pig's side to stifle his sobs. In the muffled cave behind the leaves, his face pressed against the sleeping pig. Tien Pao had to let go, had to cry himself out. And then he slept. And while he slept, night fell. It was deep, dark night when Tien Pao awoke. He cautiously pushed away some of the leaves and peered out of the cave. The mountains lay in black silence. Tien Pao listened long. Then to his ears came a slight sound, and the blood started pounding in his ears. He clung to his pig. Something was coming in the dark. Came running straight towards him and the cave. Tien Pao's heart stood still. Long frozen moments later, he began to realise that the soft running sound was the sound of the river. Why, of course. Below the mountains ran the river. And then Tien Pao could manage a hollow little laugh at himself. He laughed at himself again, a little louder. It somehow made him feel bolder, braver. Now that he knew what it was, the running sound of the river actually made him feel safer. It was the river. Somehow, in running wildly away from the children on the grassy hill, he had blundered back to the river. The sound of the river was good. It was a guide. He must never go away from the sound of the river, Tien Pao decided. Since he'd have to travel by night, the river's sound would have to lead him home. Oh, the sound of the river was good. The river had taken him away. The river would take him back. Back to Heng Yang, and his mother and his father and the baby sister. Tien Pao mumbled a little prayer to the river god, the good river god. Bring me home. Bring me safely home. As if he could still reach home that night, Tien Pao grabbed the rope, pushed himself out of the cave, and pulled the unwilling, sleep-warm pig out after him. Together they started out through the little black mountains. 5 nights later, Tien Pao and Glory of the Republic were still in the little river mountains. The going was painfully slow. Tien Pao forced himself up still another steep mountain path. His knees buckled under him. He had the little pig slung over his shoulder, but it was too much. He was too weak with hunger. But he had to carry Glory of the Republic. The little pig was not made to climb mountains. The sharp rocks cut his feet. Grinding gravel dug between his narrow cloven hooves. His feet were bleeding. Tien Pao felt his way up the path. He pulled himself up by the jutting rock wall that loomed over him. His fingers touched a bunch of grass. He tore it up by the roots and brought it to his mouth. The gritty grass under his teeth nauseated him. Made him feel sick. He gave it to the little pig on his shoulder. At least Glory of the Republic could eat grass. He could eat, but he couldn't walk. Soon Tien Pao knew he himself would not be able to walk any more. The hunger gnawed too fiercely. It burned and gnawed all night long. Every slow step of the back-breaking way, it never let up. It only dulled when, stupefied with exhaustion, he slept in some little cave. Halfway up the steep path, Tien Pao had to set the pig down. Enormous ballooning black spots came swimming before his eyes. He backed away until spots before his eyes. He backed away until he felt a rock. He leaned against it. Cold, clammy sweat stood out on him. He pulled his eyes wide with fingers to make the lilting spots go away. Still they ballooned before his eyes, darker than the night, and they were everywhere. They were above him and before him, huge, threatening, closing in on him. It must be hunger. It was only hunger. It was only that he was weak and dizzy from hunger. That's what made the spots. There wasn't really anything else. Tien Pao shook his head to clear it, but fear clamped his heart. He wasn't alone. They were still there. Things on the path. Spirits? Were these the evil spirits of the mountains he'd often heard about in his village? The old people kept talking about them and their horror, how they hid in caves, oozed out of rocks. Now they were coming for him. They had waited until he was weak, but now they were everywhere, leering down at him from all the rocks, lilting, lifting, reaching out. Tien Pao tried to shake away the terror. They weren't real. It was only because he was so weak and hungry. They kept coming. Tien Pao tore his eyes away from the coming horror and looked down. The little pig wasn't beside him. Glory of the Republic was gone. Without a sound, they'd got Glory of the Republic. With a cry of terror, Tien Pao broke and ran. He ran with the mad strength of terror, blindly, headlong down the mountain. The evil came right on behind him. Rattling rocks, sharp crunching gravel rolled at his heels. Tien Pao threw himself ahead of the rattling sounds. He could hear panting. It kept coming at his heels. Tien Pao could not keep up his headlong speed down the mountain. He tripped. He hurtled into space. With a great scary splash, he was flung headlong into water. Gasping with the shock, Tien Pao struggled to a sitting position in the muddy water. But water, mud. Then this was a rice paddy. But then he was out of the mountains. Then he was safe from the terrible spirits of the mountains. A rice paddy. Tien Pao almost lay back in it as if it were a bed, so great was his relief. He breathed deep. All of a sudden something nudged Tien Pao's arm. Tien Pao reared up out of the water. It was Glory of the Republic. They hadn't got Glory of the Republic. Why, it must have been the little pig that had come bowling on behind him in his wild flight down the mountain. That was why the gravel had rattled. That was the panting. Foolish with relief, Tien Pao sat back in the water and pulled the little pig into his lap. Why, all the time it had been his own wonderful pig, not spirits. Glory of the Republic was far more interested in the muddy paddy than in being gratefully petted. He squirmed free and, grunting happily, he wallowed up to his nostrils in the oozy mud. Tien Pao fondly watched him, and watching the pig gave Tien Pao a good useful idea. It was easy to sit here in the rice paddy below the mountain and not be too afraid of the mountain spirits. But he had to go back up into the mountains. This was a rice paddy, and rice paddies meant that people were near. Tien Pao could dimly see the shadowy wall of a village compound looming up behind the misty paddies. Japanese soldiers might be quartered right behind that wall. And I think we'll leave it there for now, before we again join Tien Pao and Glory of the Republic on their very dangerous journey.